"You saw everything. Now take responsibility," the Apache girl demanded. The rancher claimed he only helped you saw everything. "Now take responsibility," the Apache girl demanded. The rancher claimed he only helped the rifle shot echoed across the canyon before Jake Martinez even saw the smoke. He jerked his horse to a stop, hand already reaching for his own Winchester. Another shot cracked through the desert air, closer this time. His stallion danced nervously beneath him as Jake scanned the rocky terrain ahead. Movement caught his eye, a figure running hard between the scrub brush and boulders, darting like a rabbit with wolves on its tail. 3 riders burst over the ridge behind the runner, their horses kicking up dust clouds that hung in the still morning air. Jake recognized the lead rider immediately, Billy Crow, a gun for hire who worked for whoever paid the most. The kind of man who would shoot a dog just to watch it die. The runners stumbled, caught themselves, kept moving. That's when Jake saw it was a young woman, her dark hair streaming behind her, a leather satchel clutched tight against her chest. Billy raised his pistol, took aim at the woman's back. Jake didn't think. He spurred his horse forward, pulling his rifle in one smooth motion, and fired a shot into the air. The crack split the morning wide open. Billy's horse reared, the shot went wild, and all 3 riders wheeled around to face this new threat. The woman used those precious seconds to dive behind a cluster of rocks 50 yards ahead. Jake rode hard toward her position, keeping his body low against his horse's neck. Bullets whined past his head like angry hornets. He heard Billy shouting orders to his men, heard them spreading out to flank him. Jake's heart hammered against his ribs as he reached the rocks and threw himself from the saddle. His boots hit the ground running, and he scrambled behind the boulder where the woman crouched, breathing hard, her dark eyes blazing with a mixture of fear and fury. She was Apache, maybe 18 or 19, with high cheekbones and a determined set to her jaw that told Jake she had already survived things that would break most people. Blood seeped through her shirt at the shoulder, but she held that satchel like it contained the last water in the desert. She glared at him with suspicion that cut sharper than any knife. More shots rang out, chips of rock exploding near their heads. Billy and his men had dismounted, taking up positions in the rocks around them. They were surrounded on 3 sides with nothing but open desert at their backs. Jake counted the rounds left in his rifle. Not enough. Not nearly enough for 3 trained killers who had no reason to let either of them walk away. The woman spoke, her English perfect despite the slight accent that colored her words. Her voice came out steady, controlled, nothing like someone who had just been running for her life. That impressed Jake more than he wanted to admit. She said her name was Nina, and she needed to reach the fort 15 miles north before sunset. When Jake asked why, she clutched that satchel tighter and said he had already seen too much. He had involved himself whether he wanted to or not. Now he had a choice to make, and she made it clear that choice would define what kind of man he really was. Part 2, Jake pressed his back against the boulder, reloading his rifle with practiced hands while bullets continued to ping off the rocks around them. Nina watched him with those intense dark eyes, waiting for an answer he wasn't ready to give. He was a rancher, not a hired gun, not a soldier, just a man trying to get his cattle to market before the bank foreclosed on his land. Getting killed in a desert shootout hadn't been part of his plans for the day. Billy Crow's voice carried across the rocks, smooth as snake oil. He called out to Jake by name, which meant Billy knew exactly who had interfered. That was bad news. Billy said this was none of Jake's business, said the girl had stolen something valuable, said Jake could ride away right now and Billy would forget the whole thing. It was a lie. Jake knew Billy's reputation. The man never forgot anything, and he never left witnesses. Nina shifted beside him, checking her own pistol, a small revolver that looked almost delicate in her hands. Jake noticed her movements were efficient, trained. This wasn't her first fight. She caught him looking and met his gaze without flinching. She told him Billy worked for Colonel Henry Preston, the new commander at Fort Davis. Preston had been selling army rifles to Mexican raiders across the border, making a fortune while settlers and Apache alike paid the price in blood. The satchel contained Preston's ledgers, proof of every sale, every payment, every murdered family that could be traced back to his greed. Jake felt his stomach drop. This was bigger than a simple theft. This was treason, the kind of thing that could start a war or end one, depending on who got their hands on that evidence. He asked Nina how she got the ledgers. She said her cousin worked as a servant in Preston's house, had copied the records page by page over 6 months, hiding them until Nina could get them to the territorial governor. Her cousin had been found out 3 days ago. Preston's men had killed her, burned her body to hide the evidence, but Nina had already taken the satchel and run. The shooting stopped suddenly, leaving only the desert wind whistling through the rocks. That silence felt more dangerous than the bullets. Jake risked a glance around the boulder and saw Billy's men moving, spreading wider, setting up for a final assault. They would rush the position from 3 directions at once, overwhelming them with firepower. Jake and Nina might take 1 or 2 down, but the outcome was already written in the dust. Nina spoke again, her voice quiet but firm. She said she wasn't asking Jake to die for her cause. She said if he created a distraction, drew their fire for just 30 seconds, she could make it to his horse and ride for the fort. She was smaller, lighter. The horse could outrun Billy's men if she got a head start. Jake would probably die, but he would die knowing he had done something that mattered. She said it without emotion, just laying out the facts like she was discussing the weather. That cold calculation bothered Jake more than the bullets had. He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw something behind that hard exterior. Grief, raw and fresh, barely contained. Her cousin hadn't just been family. They had been close, probably grew up together, shared secrets and dreams the way young women do. Nina had watched her die for doing the right thing, and now she was prepared to watch Jake die for the same reason. The weight of that guilt showed in the tight corners of her mouth, the way she wouldn't quite meet his eyes when she talked about the distraction. Jake surprised himself by laughing, a short bark of sound that made Nina frown in confusion. He told her that was the worst plan he had ever heard, and he had heard some truly terrible plans in his time. He wasn't going to die in a desert shootout just to maybe give her a chance to reach a fort that might not even believe her story. Instead, he had a different idea, one that was probably just as stupid but at least gave them both a chance to see tomorrow. The desert floor sloped away behind their position, dropping into a dry wash that cut through the rocks like a scar. It was invisible from Billy's position, hidden by the angle of the boulders. If they could reach that wash, they could use it for cover, work their way west along the bottom until they were out of rifle range, then circle back to where Jake had left his horse. It would mean crawling through cactus and sharp rocks, slow, dangerous work while Billy's men closed in, but it beat Nina's suicide plan by a considerable margin. Nina studied the terrain, her tactical mind clearly working through the angles and distances. She shook her head, said they would never make it, said Billy would hear them moving and cut them down before they reached the wash. Jake grinned despite the situation, and told her he had one more trick up his sleeve, something Billy wouldn't expect because it was so completely insane. He was going to give Billy exactly what he wanted, or at least make him think he was. Jake cupped his hands around his mouth and shouted that he was coming out, that he wanted to talk deal. Nina grabbed his arm, her grip surprisingly strong, eyes wide with betrayal. She thought he was going to hand her over, trade her life for his own. Jake met her gaze and held it, letting her see the truth there. He wasn't abandoning her. He was buying them time, 60 seconds of confusion while Billy tried to figure out what game Jake was playing. That was all they needed. Billy called back, suspicious but interested. He said Jake had 1 minute to step out where he could be seen, hands empty, no tricks. Jake nodded at Nina, pointed at the wash, mouthed the word, go. She hesitated for 1 heartbeat, 2, then understanding flashed across her face. She moved, quick and silent as a shadow, sliding backward on her belly toward the edge of the drop. Jake stood up slowly, hands raised, stepping around the boulder into Billy's sight. 3 rifle barrels swung to track him. Billy smiled, and Jake saw death in that smile. Behind him, hidden by his body in the angle of the rocks, Nina disappeared over the edge into the wash. Jake started talking, buying every second with words that meant nothing, walking forward with his hands up and his heart in his throat, waiting for the moment when Billy realized he had been played. Part 3, Billy Crow's smile faltered as Jake walked closer, too close for a man who was supposedly surrendering. Billy's eyes narrowed, and Jake saw the exact moment when the gunman understood something was wrong. Billy's gaze flicked past Jake to the empty rocks behind him, and his face went dark with rage. He brought his rifle up fast. But Jake was already moving, diving sideways as the shot cracked past his ear so close he felt the heat of it. Jake hit the ground rolling, came up running, legs pumping hard as he sprinted for the wash. More shots rang out, kicking up dirt at his heels. He heard Billy screaming orders, heard boots pounding on rock as the 3 men gave chase. 20 yards to the edge. 15. A bullet tugged at his jacket. 10 yards. He could see the drop now, could see Nina below, already moving west along the bottom of the wash. 5 yards. He launched himself into the air and felt gravity take him. The landing knocked the wind from his lungs, sharp rocks jabbing into his back and shoulders. Nina grabbed his collar and dragged him deeper into cover as bullets chewed up the edge above them. They scrambled along the wash bottom, keeping low, using every depression and boulder for protection. Behind them, Jake heard Billy organizing his men, sending 1 to bring the horses, while the other 2 worked their way down into the wash on foot. The wash twisted through the landscape like a snake, its banks ranging from 6 to 15 feet high, depending on how hard the flash floods had cut through over the years. Nina moved with the confidence of someone who knew this terrain, who had spent her whole life reading the desert the way other people read books. She led them through narrow passages between boulders, under overhangs that provided blessed shade from the climbing sun, always heading west, always putting distance between them and Billy's men. They emerged from the wash an hour later, hot and bleeding from a dozen scrapes, but alive. Jake's horse stood right where he had left it, calmly grazing on the tough desert grass that grew in patches between the rocks. Nina approached the animal carefully, speaking soft Apache words that made the stallion's ears prick forward with interest. She had a way with horses, Jake noticed, the kind of natural horsemanship that came from growing up in the saddle. They rode double, Nina behind Jake, her arms wrapped around his waist to keep from falling. The horse didn't like the extra weight but settled into a steady pace when Jake urged him forward. They headed northwest, away from the fort, away from Billy Crow and his hired killers. Nina protested, said they were going the wrong direction, said every minute they delayed gave Preston more time to cover his tracks or run. Jake told her running straight to the fort would get them killed and dead people couldn't deliver evidence to anyone. He had a better plan, he explained. His ranch lay 10 miles northwest, nestled in a box canyon with only one way in. They could hole up there, tend their wounds, and wait until dark. Then they would take the back trails to the fort, the ones only locals knew about, approaching from the south where Preston wouldn't expect them. It would add hours to their journey but subtract years from their lives compared to riding straight into whatever trap Preston was setting. Nina didn't like it, but she didn't have a better option. She asked Jake why he was helping her, really helping her, risking his life and his property for a cause that wasn't his fight. He thought about that question while the horse carried them across the desert, thought about all the easy lies he could tell. Instead, he told her the truth. 5 years ago, Apache raiders had hit his ranch, stolen half his cattle, burned his barn. He had been ready to ride out with the militia, ready to kill every Apache he could find. But then he learned those raiders had been using stolen army rifles, traced them back to a corrupt quartermaster at Fort Stockton who had been selling weapons to whoever had gold. That quartermaster had gotten rich while ranchers and Apache killed each other over his greed. Jake had killed that quartermaster, shot him in a hotel in El Paso, made it look like a robbery gone wrong. No one mourned the man, and no one looked too hard at the circumstances. But Jake remembered the look in the quartermaster's eyes when he realized what was happening, remembered feeling nothing but cold satisfaction as the life drained out of him. It hadn't brought back his barn or his cattle, hadn't undone any of the bloodshed, but it had been justice of a sort. When he saw Nina running from Billy Crow, saw her risking everything to stop another man just like that quartermaster, he knew he couldn't ride away. Some things mattered more than cattle and bank loans. Nina was quiet for a long time after that confession. When she finally spoke, she said killing Preston wouldn't solve anything. The army would just replace him with another officer, another man who saw the frontier as a place to get rich instead of a place to serve. The only way to stop the corruption was to expose it, bring it into the light where everyone could see. That's why the ledgers mattered so much. That's why her cousin had died making sure those records survived. They reached Jake's ranch in late afternoon, the sun already sliding toward the western horizon. The ranch wasn't much to look at, a small house built from adobe and timber, a rebuilt barn, corrals for horses and cattle, but it was his, earned with sweat and blood and stubbornness. Nina slid from the horse and immediately checked the approaches, her tactical instincts taking over. She pointed out 3 places where someone could set up an ambush, asked if Jake had any rifles cached, any escape routes prepared. He was starting to understand that Nina hadn't just carried those ledgers. She had been trained for this, prepared for the possibility that she might need to fight a war instead of just delivering evidence. Jake brought her inside and started tending to the bullet wound in her shoulder. It was a clean through and through, painful but not life-threatening. Nina sat stone still while he cleaned and bandaged it, not making a sound even when the whiskey he used to sterilize the wound must have burned like fire. She asked about Jake's family, why a man his age lived alone on a ranch this size. He said his wife had died in childbirth 3 years back, the baby with her. He hadn't seen much point in remarrying, hadn't seen much point in anything until the bank started threatening foreclosure and forced him to care again. They ate cold beans and tortillas, not daring to light a fire that might draw attention. Nina pulled the satchel open and showed Jake the ledgers, page after page of careful handwriting documenting Preston's crimes. Dates, amounts, names of the buyers, locations of the transfers. It was damning evidence, enough to hang Preston and half a dozen other officers who had been helping him. Nina's cousin had been meticulous, cross-referencing everything, noting every detail that might prove useful in a court-martial. As they studied the records, Jake noticed something that made his blood run cold. One of the buyers listed in the ledgers was Miguel Santos, the leader of the Mexican raiders who had hit Jake's ranch 5 years ago. The sale had been arranged by that same corrupt quartermaster Jake had killed, which meant Preston and that quartermaster had been working together, part of the same network. The man Jake had killed wasn't an isolated case of corruption. He had been part of something bigger, something that had been poisoning the frontier for years. Night fell over the desert like a curtain, bringing a chill that made them both glad for the shelter of the house. They would leave in 2 hours, Jake decided, give themselves enough time to reach the fort before dawn. Nina cleaned her pistol with methodical care, checking each chamber, each bullet. Jake did the same with his rifle, going through the familiar ritual that had kept him alive through range wars and Apache raids and a dozen other dangers. The sound of approaching horses shattered the quiet. Jake moved to the window and felt his stomach drop. 5 riders coming up the canyon, moving slow and careful, spreading out as they approached the house. Billy Crow had found them, probably followed their tracks across the desert, picked up their trail like a bloodhound, and he had brought reinforcements. Part 4, Jake doused the lantern, plunging the house into darkness. Nina moved beside him, her pistol already drawn, peering through the window at the approaching riders. Billy Crow sat his horse in the center, flanked by his 2 original men plus 2 new guns Jake didn't recognize, 5 against 2, with the 5 holding the high ground and surrounding the house. The smart move would be to surrender, hand over the ledgers, hope Billy felt merciful. But Jake knew Billy didn't have mercy in him, never had, and Preston couldn't afford to leave witnesses alive. Billy's voice carried across the yard, false friendliness coating every word, like honey over poison. He called out to Jake, said there was no need for anyone else to die today, said Preston was willing to pay good money for those ledgers and everyone could walk away rich. Jake didn't bother responding. Words wouldn't change what was coming, and Billy knew it as well as he did. This was going to end in blood. The only question was whose. Nina touched Jake's arm, pointed to the back of the house, where a small window looked out on the rear approach to the canyon. She whispered that if one of them could reach that window, slip out, and make it to the rocks behind the house, they could set up a crossfire that might even the odds. It was a long shot, probably suicidal, but staying in the house was just waiting to die. Billy would eventually torch the place, burn them out like rats in a barrel. At least this way they could fight back. Jake shook his head. He wasn't letting Nina take that risk. This was his ranch, his fight, and he had already involved himself too deep to back out now. He told her to stay by the front window, keep Billy's attention focused there, make them think both defenders were dug in at that position. He would take the back route, get into position, and when he opened fire from behind, Nina should hit them from the house. With luck, they might drop 2 or 3 before the others even knew what was happening. Nina grabbed his wrist, her grip fierce. She said this wasn't just his fight, that he didn't get to decide who took the risks. Her cousin had died for these ledgers. Her people had suffered for years because of men like Preston, and she wasn't going to hide in a house while someone else did her fighting. But Jake had already made his decision. He pressed his rifle into her hands, gave her his ammunition, and told her to make every shot count. Then he slipped toward the back of the house before she could argue further. The window was small and high, barely large enough for Jake to squeeze through. He went head first, trying to minimize the noise, feeling glass scrape against his jacket. He dropped onto the hard-packed dirt behind the house and froze, listening for any sign that Billy's men had heard him. Nothing but desert wind and the nervous stamping of horses out front. He low-crawled toward the rocks, moving slowly, placing each hand and knee with care. A shot rang out from the front of the house. Nina had opened fire, and Jake heard a man scream. He risked a glance back and saw one of Billy's men tumbling from his saddle, clutching his leg. Nina could shoot, Jake realized, really shoot, better than most men he had known. Billy and the others scattered, abandoning the frontal approach, looking for cover in the sparse terrain around the house. That gave Jake the opening he needed. He reached the rocks and worked his way up, finding a position that gave him sight lines to 3 of the 5 riders. Jake drew his pistol, the rifle being back in the house with Nina. He wasn't as good with a handgun as he was with a long gun, but he could hit a man at 50 yards if he took his time. He picked his target carefully, one of the new men Billy had brought, a lean kid who looked barely 20. The kid had taken cover behind a water trough, his back to Jake's position, completely focused on the house. Jake steadied his breathing, aimed for center mass, and squeezed the trigger. The pistol bucked in his hand. The kid jerked forward, slammed into the water trough, and went still. Billy Crow spun around, eyes scanning the rocks, his weathered face twisted with fury. He spotted Jake and brought his rifle up, but Jake was already moving, scrambling higher into the rocks as Billy's shot ricocheted off stone inches from his head. Now Billy knew where he was, knew the attack was coming from 2 directions. The advantage of surprise was gone. What followed was a deadly game of cat and mouse played out in the darkness. Jake moved through the rocks, taking a shot when he could, then relocating before return fire found him. Nina kept up a steady barrage from the house, not wasting ammunition but letting Billy's men know she was still in the fight. The wounded man from her first shot had crawled behind a bush and wasn't moving much. The kid Jake had shot wasn't moving at all. That left Billy and 2 others, better odds than before but still not good enough. Billy was shouting orders, directing his men to flank both positions, trying to coordinate an assault that would overwhelm the defenders through sheer firepower. But his men were scared now, realizing this wasn't going to be the easy job they had signed up for. They moved slowly, reluctantly, keeping to cover, taking their time. That caution gave Jake and Nina precious minutes to make their shots count. Jake worked his way around to the east, trying to get behind Billy's position. He saw one of the remaining men crouched behind a boulder, clearly trying to work up the courage to rush the house. Jake put a bullet through the man's shoulder, spinning him around. The man dropped his rifle and ran, stumbling back down the canyon, done with the fight. 2 down, 1 wounded and fleeing, 2 remaining, Billy and 1 other. The final hired gun made a break for the house, running hard, firing as he went. Glass shattered as his bullets punched through windows. Nina returned fire, and Jake heard the sharp crack of her shooting. The man twisted, fell, lay still. Just Billy now, alone against 2 opponents who had already proven they could shoot. Jake saw the calculation in Billy's eyes, saw him weighing his options. Pride warred with survival instinct. Pride lost. Billy whistled for his horse, swung into the saddle, and spurred away down the canyon, riding hard into the darkness. Jake climbed down from the rocks, his hands shaking with adrenaline. Nina emerged from the house, the rifle still gripped tight in her hands, her face pale in the moonlight. They stood in the yard, surrounded by the wounded and the dead, and looked at each other with the kind of understanding that only comes from surviving something terrible together. Jake had thought this would be over after they delivered the ledgers. He was starting to realize it was just beginning. Nina walked to the nearest body and checked for a pulse. Dead. She moved to the next. Also dead. The man she had wounded in the leg was unconscious from blood loss, but still breathing. She used strips torn from her shirt to bandage him, working with the same calm efficiency she had shown cleaning her pistol. Jake asked why she was helping a man who had just tried to kill her. She said because they weren't like Preston and Billy, they didn't kill unless they had to, and leaving a man to bleed out was something Preston would do. They dragged the bodies away from the house, lined them up with the respect the dead men probably didn't deserve. The wounded man they tied to a post, left him water and bandages, figured he would live if Billy bothered to come back for him. Then they gathered what supplies they could carry, loaded Jake's horse with food and ammunition, and prepared to ride out. The ranch was compromised now. Billy knew where it was, and he would come back with more men or burn the place to the ground out of spite. Jake took one last look at the house he had built, the life he had scraped together from nothing, and felt the weight of what he was giving up. Nina saw the look on his face and said nothing, but her hand found his for just a moment, squeezed once, then let go. It was the first gesture of real warmth she had shown him, and it meant more than words could express. They mounted up and rode out, leaving the ranch behind, heading for Fort Davis and whatever waited for them there. The moon hung low and full, lighting their way across the desert, turning the sand to silver and the shadows to pools of ink. Part 5. The back trails Nina led them through were treacherous in the darkness, narrow paths that wound between cliffs and dropped off into ravines that could swallow a horse and rider without a trace. But Nina navigated them with the confidence of someone who had traveled these routes 100 times, probably running messages for her people, maybe scouting for Apache war parties before the army finally corralled most of her tribe onto reservations. Jake didn't ask about her past. He figured she would tell him if she wanted him to know, and pushing for answers with just closed doors better left open. They reached a ridgeline overlooking Fort Davis just as false dawn began to paint the eastern sky pale gray. The fort spread out below them, a collection of buildings arranged in a rough square, with walls that were more symbolic than defensive. Soldiers moved between structures, going about morning routines, completely unaware that 2 riders on the ridge above them carried evidence that would destroy their commanding officer. Nina pulled out a small telescope from her satchel and studied the fort carefully, her eyes scanning for any sign of unusual activity. She pointed out Preston's quarters, a larger building set apart from the others, with guards posted at the door even at this early hour. That told Jake everything he needed to know. Preston was scared, knew someone was coming for him, had beefed up his security in anticipation of trouble. Smart, but not smart enough. Nina explained that the territorial governor's representative, a man named Charles Dawson, had arrived at the fort 2 days ago on routine inspection. That's why Nina's cousin had chosen this moment to act, why she had copied the final records and prepared to run. With Dawson at the fort, they had someone with the authority to arrest Preston on the spot, someone who couldn't be bullied or bribed into looking the other way. The plan was simple, maybe too simple. They would ride into the fort openly, request an immediate audience with Dawson, and present the evidence. With witnesses present, Preston couldn't just shoot them or make them disappear. He would be forced to answer charges in front of his own men, in front of the representative from the territorial government. Public exposure was their only protection, the only thing standing between them and unmarked graves in the desert. Jake pointed out the obvious flaw in this plan. They had to get to Dawson before Preston realized they were there, had to reach him fast enough that Preston couldn't organize a response. Once they rode through that gate, they would be in Preston's territory, surrounded by soldiers who followed his orders, trapped if things went wrong. Nina met his gaze steadily and said she knew the risks, had calculated them 100 times over the past 3 days. This was the only way to make sure the truth came out, to make sure her cousin hadn't died for nothing. They waited until full sunrise, when the fort would be most active, most distracted. Then they rode down the ridge and approached the main gate at an easy pace, nothing that would raise immediate alarm. The sentries challenged them, asked their business. Jake did the talking, said they were bringing urgent information for the territorial representative, information that couldn't wait. The guards looked uncertain, clearly not sure whether to admit them or turn them away. One went to fetch the officer of the day while the other kept his rifle pointed in their general direction, not threatening but not welcoming either. The officer who arrived was a young lieutenant named Davies, fresh-faced and earnest, probably new to the frontier. Jake recognized the type, still believed in honor and duty and all the ideals they taught at West Point. Jake played to that idealism, told Davies they had evidence of corruption that the territorial representative needed to see immediately, hinted at things bad enough that delaying even an hour could cost lives. Davies looked at Nina, at the blood on her shirt and the exhaustion in her eyes, and made a decision. He ordered the gates opened and provided them an escort to Dawson's quarters. They crossed the fort yard with Davies and 2 privates flanking them, their boots raising dust that hung golden in the morning light. Soldiers stopped to stare at the strange procession, Apache woman and dust-covered rancher being marched through their midst. Jake saw curtains twitch in Preston's quarters, knew the colonel was watching, knew the countdown had begun, how long before Preston acted, before he sent men to intercept them, before everything went to hell. Dawson's quarters were modest, befitting a government functionary rather than a military officer. Davies knocked, announced the visitors, ushered them inside. Charles Dawson stood from behind a desk covered in papers and ledgers, his spectacles catching the light from the window. He was older than Jake expected, maybe 60, with iron-gray hair and sharp, intelligent eyes that took in every detail of his unexpected visitors. Davies started to explain, but Dawson waved him silent, his attention fixed on the leather satchel. Nina clutched so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Nina stepped forward and placed the satchel on Dawson's desk. She spoke clearly, without emotion, laying out the facts like she was reporting the weather. Colonel Henry Preston had been selling army rifles to Mexican raiders for 18 months. Her cousin, a servant in his household, had documented every transaction. The proof was in the ledgers. Preston had discovered the leak 3 days ago and had her cousin killed. Nina had taken the evidence and run. Preston's men had chased her. Jake Martinez had intervened and helped her reach the fort. That was the truth, simple and devastating. Dawson opened the satchel and pulled out the ledgers, his expression growing darker with each page he turned. He asked questions, sharp, precise questions about dates and locations and people named in the records. Nina answered each one without hesitation, her memory perfect, her testimony unshakable. Jake watched Dawson's face and saw the moment when skepticism turned to belief, saw the official realize the magnitude of what he was holding. This wasn't just one corrupt officer. This was systematic betrayal, evidence that would reach all the way to Washington, that would destroy careers and possibly end with hangings. The door burst open. Preston strode in, 3 armed soldiers at his back, his face flushed with barely controlled fury. He demanded to know what was happening in his fort, demanded that Dawson hand over the satchel and the Apache girl immediately. Dawson stood slowly, his movement deliberate, and Jake saw steel in the old man that hadn't been apparent before. Dawson informed Preston that he was relieving him of command, effective immediately, pending an investigation into charges of treason and murder. Preston should consider himself under arrest. Preston's hand dropped to his pistol. The soldiers behind him looked uncertain, caught between 2 authorities, not sure who to obey. Jake's hand was already on his own gun, waiting for Preston to make the move that would end this. Nina stood perfectly still, her face showing nothing, but Jake knew she was ready to fight if fighting became necessary. The room held its breath, 5 seconds that stretched into eternity. Lieutenant Davies broke the silence. He stepped forward and placed himself between Preston and Dawson, his young face set with determination. He said Colonel Preston should surrender his weapon, that he was bound by oath to obey the territorial representative's authority, that resisting would only make things worse. The 3 soldiers behind Preston looked at each other, looked at Davies, and slowly lowered their rifles. Preston stood alone, his support crumbling around him, his empire of corruption collapsing in real time. Preston's hand came away from his pistol empty. The fight went out of him all at once, his shoulders sagging, his face aging 10 years in 10 seconds. Davies removed Preston's sidearm and sword, handed them to one of the privates, ordered the colonel confined to quarters under guard. Preston went without protest, a broken man shuffling away between 2 soldiers, everything he had built destroyed by one servant girl's courage and careful handwriting. Dawson collapsed back into his chair, suddenly looking every one of his 60 years. He told Nina her cousin was a hero, that what she had done would save countless lives, that the territorial government would make sure her sacrifice was remembered. Nina nodded once, accepting the words but not comforted by them. Jake understood. Praise and honors didn't bring dead people back, didn't undo the pain and loss. Justice wasn't the same as healing. Jake and Nina left Fort Davis 3 hours later, after giving their statements, after watching Preston being led away in chains, after accepting Dawson's thanks and promises that they would be called to testify at the court-martial. They rode out the main gate and headed west, back toward the desert and the ruins of Jake's ranch. They didn't talk much, both too exhausted for conversation, both processing everything that had happened in the past 24 hours. Nina broke the silence when they stopped to rest the horse at a spring 10 miles from the fort. She said Jake had lost everything because of her, his ranch probably burned by now, his life turned upside down, all because he had chosen to help a stranger. She asked what he would do now, where he would go. Jake thought about that question, looked at the desert stretching endlessly in all directions, looked at this fierce young woman who had risked everything for justice. He said he would rebuild, start over, probably find some other patch of land that nobody wanted and try to make it productive. That's what ranchers did. They kept trying, no matter how many times the land or the weather or corrupt officers knocked them down. He paused, then added that he could use help with that rebuilding, if she was interested, if she didn't have somewhere else she needed to be. Nina looked surprised, then something that might have been hope flickered across her face. She said her people were scattered, on reservations or hiding in the mountains, and she had no family left after her cousin's death. She said she had spent years fighting, years running, and maybe it was time to try building something, instead of just tearing down corruption. She said if Jake was serious about the offer, she would consider it, but she wanted to be clear that she wouldn't be anyone's servant or decoration. She would be a partner, equal in all ways, with an equal say in how things were done. Jake grinned and extended his hand. Partners, then, he said, equal in all ways, building something new out of the ashes of what was lost. Nina shook his hand, her grip strong and sure, and for the first time since Jake had seen her running through the desert, she smiled. It transformed her face, made her look younger, made the future seem possible instead of just something to survive. They rode on together as the sun climbed toward noon, 2 survivors heading toward an uncertain future but heading there together. Behind them, Fort Davis faded into the heat shimmer, taking with it Colonel Preston and his crimes and the old way of doing things. Ahead lay desert and possibility, hardship and hope mixed together like they always were on the frontier. Jake figured that was as good as life ever got, and he was grateful for it.